David and Goliath struggle. Denmark and the United States of America are engaged in a monumental game of chicken about the future of Greenland. What's clear is that the small population of the largest island on the planet are going to be pawns on a geopolitical chessboard for some time to come. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Ian Proud. I'm the Peacemonger. It's just past 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Wednesday, the 7th of January. And I wanted to take today a cold and clinical foreign policy look at recent events over Greenland that have been playing out vividly in the press. What's clear is that Donald Trump has got European governments in an absolute spin about the future status of Greenland. He stated his desire to annex Greenland in some unspecified way. His press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, notably said that the United States of America was ready to utilize the military as an option of the commander in chief, being said Donald Trump. Let's be clear. Denmark would be not able to resist American military annexation of Greenland. With 1.3 million active military personnel, it dwarfs Denmark with 20,000 active army personnel. The United States of America spends twice as much on defense each year as the other members of NATO combined. That's a formidable mathematical kind of dominance that it has over the rest of NATO. But nonetheless, I see very little likelihood of the US going to war with Denmark over Greenland. The threat obviously has to be taken seriously, but this appears to be a classic Trumpian bluster aimed at securing favourable terms of the US government in any future settlement over Greenland. The first question to ask is, what do the Americans actually want? Well, they want three things, obviously. They want to deny Russia and China access to resources in Greenland. Greenland has vast mineral resources, including rare earths, and there have been signs, in particular, that China has wanted to kind of get a big foothold into that space. The United States wants to decisively deny that territory to its adversaries, being Russia, and China, and sees one way to do that being the occupation of Greenland in some way. They want to gain privileged access to US firms, as they've done recently with Venezuela, to exploit those resources in Greenland. And thirdly, they want to have a bigger footprint, a bigger security footprint within the Arctic region writ large. Now, they might be able to achieve all of these goals through strategic patience rather than resorting to military force, but that would depend on them reaching some sort of a deal with Denmark, which appears extremely unlikely at the moment, while Donald Trump continues to act in a bellicose way. Now, Trump may be reckoning on the art of the deal, forcing Denmark into backing down and agreeing to some sort of sale of Greenland to the US. Hence, this big game of chicken that's going on right now between the two countries. But any deal to allow US annexation of Greenland would amount to a modern day version of the Munich Agreement to allow Adolf Hitler to annex the Sudetenlands. Trump's calculus, like Adolf Hitler's, would be that no major European power would be willing to fight to prevent a military aggression against Greenland and would therefore settle to avoid that possibility. France and Britain would almost certainly not step in to fight the United States over its military move on Greenland, not least because they're fully occupied with plans for European defence, in particular, these still ambiguous and unclear plans to support Ukraine in any post war settlement. Indeed, this week, Britain has allowed major US military build up in the UK ahead of the operation today to interdict the Russian flagged Marinera oil tanker, which actually happened, it seems, with the active cooperation of UK Army personnel. One assumes special forces personnel. European firms are so dependent on the US as an export market that they would fear collapse of the transatlantic economic relationship, perhaps more than Trump does. Quite frankly, as he wants U.S. firms to become much more self-sufficient and a much stronger driver of growth. Within the United States. They are his MAGA heartland. The workers in American factories. And so on. But nonetheless, going back to the Munich analogy, this is often, in my view, falsely being used to compare Russian action in Ukraine with Nazi action in Czechoslovakia. It doesn't necessarily work in the Russian context because there is no evidence that Russia was seeking to annex parts of Ukraine before the war started in February 2022. Quite the opposite. Actually, the terms of the Minsk II agreement, which I referred to in a previous discussion, actually recognized that the Donbass would remain part of Ukraine, and it was Russia's move to really to prevent moves to incorporate Ukraine into NATO, which actually were the source of its increasingly kind of antagonistic posture towards the West at the back end of 2021, and its decision ultimately to go to war to prevent NATO, expansion. It was against the threat of what it considered to be military aggression by the Western NATO alliance that Russia chose to act, preemptively to prevent that possibility. And it looks like, they may well ultimately succeed, depending on what the terms of a final peace deal look like. But it's impossible to see Russia agreeing a peace deal without NATO being taken off the table. But taking this back to Greenland, Donald Trump is vocally saying, "I want Greenland, and I'm going to have Greenland." That is a pretty direct comparison with Adolf Hitler, in 1938. Nevertheless, a US military takeover of Greenland would be both a shocking breach of international law and an unrecoverable humiliation for political elites in Europe, itself. European leaders would struggle with elections on the horizon over the period from 2027 to 2029 across France, Poland, Germany, and the United Kingdom, the four kind of really big powerful military kind of countries in Europe, that they'd stood back and watched the United States march into Greenland. That would be a massive humiliation and would almost certainly lead to the fall from power from the mainstream liberal political parties, so far as I assess it at this stage. Anyway, so what happens next? Denmark has made its position very clear through its prime minister's, quite firm and I think proper statement that she's made in response to Trump's actions recently. I think she said that keep your hands off of Greenland. I think she's been right to do that, and I think in their kind of limp-wristed ways, Western leaders, including the ever unimpressive Keir Starmer, have also kind of backed her up in that, even if they're not actually prepared to back them up with military force if push comes to shove. Denmark must feel under immense pressure to concede to US demands right now. But when it comes down to it, if you look at, what will ultimately kind of settle where the direction in which this goes, Denmark's biggest ally will be US public opinion. In a poll last year, only 20% of Americans actually thought annexing Greenland would be, a good idea. Trump's shocking move to kidnap President Maduro of, Venezuela has led to widespread criticism amongst members of the opposition Democrat Party, who have, in particular, pointed up the fact that he's totally sidestepped Congress in taking this unilateral military action, against Venezuela, and that was against, the authoritarian leader of a dysfunctional Latin American nation with a track record of exporting illegal drugs, to America. While shocking, the move to oust Maduro was limited in scope, only removing him, cutting the head off the snake, if you like, but leaving other members of the ruling party, in place. The US hasn't sought to occupy Venezuela to capture access to its vast mineral resources, the largest proven oil reserves in the world, with over 300 billion barrels of proven oil reserves. under its soil, and they're clearly occupying a country of 31 million people, which would be the military task facing the US if they wanted to go in whole hog, on Venezuela, would be a much more hazardous endeavor than occupying Greenland with a population of less than 60,000, people, very clearly. But nonetheless, there seems little likelihood, at least in the short term, that the US would sanction this military action. At least it seems to me, even though the Republicans, have a majority in the houses. I mean, there would be some splintering of, Republican support. Some Republican representatives remain skeptical about Trump's, credentials as a leader. I don't really see that Congress would authorize military action against a sovereign territory of a hitherto friendly NATO ally in cute and pretty Denmark, and therefore, even more pretty, Greenland. That would certainly lead to a shattering of NATO, which, while Trump is not a huge fan, is a massive revenue earner for US defense firms that sell lots of kit to Europe at a time when Trump has forced European states to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, which will benefit US defense firms even more with the hundreds of billions in additional kind of defense spending each year eventually that European nations, tip into defence. So I don't ultimately see that it's in Trump's interest to see NATO shattering, even if he wants to gradually retrench US position in Europe and focus more militarily, on Asia and China in particular. And there's little evidence that actually he wants to ditch completely NATO just because of the commercial benefits that the United States, gets from it. On that basis, the best posture it seems to me that Denmark can take, right now is defiance and calling Donald Trump's, bluff, and not being the first mover in terms of settling any sort of a deal. Trump's threat of military action to seize Greenland should be called out for what it is, a naked act of aggression, and Denmark should put its small military, in Greenland, on alert, defend the island against US actions. Now, that may seem like a Hail Mary kind of move. Clearly, Danish forces would be very quickly overpowered in any military confrontation with the United States. That is absolutely clear. I mean, they wouldn't stand a chance. They would, within a matter of handful of days, if that, be overpowered, and US boots would be on the ground. But that would, put the US in the position of having to justify to the American people and to, the world at large, firing upon friendly allied European troops. And quite frankly, it's hard to measure the potential damage this would do to Trump's image, not just in Europe and the rest of the world, but in the United States itself, which has, always seen itself on very friendly terms with, even if in this slightly paternalistic in a way, with the small nations, of Europe. Now, right here, the big fly in the ointment is that under the terms of the 2009 Greenland Act of Self-Government, the people of Greenland ultimately have the right to vote to secede, from Denmark. And the Americans know this very well, and this is a loophole that very clearly they're trying to exploit by putting pressure, including on the people of Greenland, to choose them, over Denmark. The Americans are hoping that with pressure and offers of massive financial investment on the basis that the Danish block grant has been frozen, and Danish financial support to Greenland is on a sort of long term decline as the people of Greenland move towards greater self sufficiency, including through exploitation of their natural resources, with huge amounts of Russian, greenbacks, on the line. The hope from the American side is that the Greenland people may be encouraged and tempted to secede, from Denmark, and align themselves with the US in some way. Now, that wouldn't necessarily have to be as part of the United States of America. I think actually, if anything, this whole tug of love, may bring out, the people of Greenland's feelings of independence and the need for self-determination. But what it could mean would be some sort of compact of free association. Now, this is an arrangement the United States of America has with a number of small Pacific Island states that it considers to be strategically important to it, dating back to essentially the aftermath of World War II, and they are the Marshall Islands, Palau, and the Federated States of Micronesia. Now, the United States has compacts of free association with all of these, tiny Pacific states, and that, offers significant economic benefits, to those states. It gives the rights of citizens of those states, to work, in the US if they want to, but it also gives the US authority, over national defense. Uh, Now, a military action by the US to claim sort of Greenland may merely kind of make the people of Greenland less susceptible to engaging with that sort of looser arrangement where they remain independent as a state, seceded from Denmark, but closely aligned with the US, economically dependent, in terms of US financial investment in their islands, and also dependent on the US for strategic defense. So both the Greenlanders and the US would win, in that arrangement. Now that's the calculus that I think that Trump is very much, making here, that he can pitch the Greenlanders on that type of offer. So, you know, what we're seeing right now is a game of chicken, not between Trump and the people of Greenland, but between Trump, and Denmark. But I mean, that, in terms of how he plays that could very easily turn, counterproductive, to US interests in Greenland if the people of Greenland increasingly see, the US as a new sort of colonizing power to replace the former colonizing power, in Denmark. So that's essentially where we are, right now. In summary, this leaves, massive US and tiny Denmark, staring at each other angrily, across the social media wires and in the mainstream, press. Uh, Trump is making a gamble that the Danes will ultimately back down and sell Greenland on favourable terms, to the US, and to make it, quite a simple matter over the coming 1 or 2 years. The Danish gamble right here, is that Trump's increasingly erratic, foreign policy adventurism may lead to a Democratic Party president arriving in power in January 2029, and they just need to wait Trump out on this and just stay calm and carry on. But that essentially leaves 3 years in which the people of Greenland are treated like pawns on a geopolitical chessboard. Quite frankly, with Europe looking increasingly weak and irrelevant, as all of this plays out, with Denmark feeling increasingly disgruntled about, the lack of support they're getting from much bigger European military powers, and with the US increasingly seen by countries in the developing world as a dangerous hegemon, clinging to the final breaths of its life before it's replaced by another power, a new power, perhaps in Asia in the form of China. So that is the sorry state of affairs that we find ourselves in. Don't expect dramatic overnight changes here. There's going to be a lot of phony war talk happening, it seems to me, for the foreseeable future on this. But watch this space. But thank you for listening. If any of that resonated with you, just drop a comment in the box, or ask me any question about this or any other foreign policy matter, which I can pick up in a later, video. And please do, as I've only just started, like and subscribe this post and my channel. I'll be interviewing some people from next week. I've got my good friend Alexander Mercuris joining me on Monday, so I can't wait to have a good old catch up with Alexander about a general tour de horizon and what's been happening in Europe, over the past kind of few weeks. And until then, I just wanted to say a big thank you for continuing to kind of watch and dial in and listen to my thoughts and observations. All of your comments and suggestions, as always, will be really welcome. But until the next time, let's keep hoping for peace. Thank you very much.